What's up YouTube? Let's look at making some kick drums in Phase Plant. So there's a couple of cool techniques that you can use in Phase Plant to create kick drums, and I kind of want to outline them for you guys in this video. So let's dive in and have a look. So if you've been following my videos already, you probably know about, sort of a little bit about how Phase Plant works. It's kind of got a bit of a modular approach to it, where you can kind of create an unlimited amount of these groups and route them to these kind of effects sections as you want. And the reason that this is particularly cool for kick drums is it allows you to isolate the different components that you use to create your kick drums and effect them individually, which is very, very cool. So here what I've done essentially is I've got my sort of my low fundamental sine wave, which is going to lane 1, and I've kind of EQ'd, and actually you can see I've boosted a little bit of that very, very low end, and same with the mid-range, and I've got another sample that I've layered in there as well. So what I want to do is I actually want to go and recreate this again from scratch with you guys, and I can show you how I built this patch and a couple of key features that make Phase Plant really cool for creating kick drums. So what we can do is let's actually just go here and add a new instance. So first things first, let's kind of set up our oscillator or our main fundamental, which we're going to be using the analog. And let's set this one to a sine wave and turn it down 2 octaves. And we're going to come back to these settings over here in a moment. And then what we can do here is we can create another group, create another analog, make this a sine wave, and turn this down by 12 semitones, 1 octave. So it's -2 octaves, -1 octave. This is going to be our sort of mid-range punch of the sound. So this is the one which we're going to actually modulate a little bit more frequency. And this one we are going to give it a little bit of envelope frequency modulation, but not as much as this one. This is the really kind of accentuated like poof sound that you hear in the kick drum, where this will be the kind of low ring out kind of section of the kick drum. And then on top of that, I'm actually going to put in a sample as well. So let's go ahead and add an output to this group over here. We can actually go and name these just to make it a little bit easier. So that's the fundamental or the body of the sound. And let's call this the punch or the transient of the sound. And then what we can do is we can add another group, and let's add a sampler. And just for simplicity's sake, I added the acoustic kick drum number 4. And let's give this one an output as well. So we've got our 3 groups. Let's actually go ahead and just name this sample, just to make life a little bit easier. So like I mentioned, we're going to be splitting this up into, we want to route them into all these different effect lanes over here. So we'll leave the fundamental body as is in lane 1. Let's set the output of the second group to lane 2. And let's set this one to lane 3. And then before we forget, let's actually head over here and set all of these to master. Because by default, what happens here is the lane 1 routes to lane 2 and then to lane 3. And if we kind of try to isolate them, it's going to create a bit of issues by doing that. So then, immediately off the bat, what we can do is we can create an envelope. And let's just get this to modulate the sort of transient by somewhere between 40 and 50. And then the body was somewhere between 30 and 40. That's where I kind of got the sweet spot for this patch. You can kind of tweak it to taste, obviously. But what we can do here is let's just get this started, and we can listen to it and audition it while we come back and tweak the sound a little bit. Silly me, I've actually forgot to change this envelope so that pitch stays really high and it's like piercing. So before we listen to it, we actually want to edit this decay pretty low, give it some slope, and turn the sustain all the way to 0. Okay, so I just switched to a different sample, something that had a little bit more sort of punch in it. I use the built-in kick attack. You can even drag in your own sample and stuff like that. So here's where we want to actually jump in and start editing each of these individual envelope settings. It might be a little bit easier to actually solo each of these lanes while you're doing so. And so the idea behind this is, for example, with the fundamental, we do want to give this some attack. So let's say about 25 to 30 milliseconds, and then quite a bit of decay and sustain down. So it's looking something like that. So the idea is with this sort of fundamental low frequency lane, we don't want too much of that transient coming through. So we're using this envelope, the attack of this envelope, to kind of fade it in a bit slower, and then we can actually go ahead here, solo this one and do the opposite, you know, leave the attack on quite a snappy setting, and for example turn the sustain and the decay down quite a lot, therefore only letting through that very transient sound. Awesome, that's sounding good. So what I like to do is I kind of like to use these outputs to kind of mix the sounds, you know, as close to perfect as possible before starting to affect them and stuff like that. I mean, it could do with a bit of like EQ separation and stuff like I was explaining in the beginning, and maybe some further effects from Phase Plant, which I'm going to show you guys, you know, how to accentuate each of these elements. So here, let's go ahead and throw in 3 slice EQs. And let's actually just solo this first one again, and our aim here is to, you know, cut out some of the high end and cut out some of the low end and maybe give it a boost somewhere, depending on, you know, where sounds best. So I also like to use, you know, compression here on my kick, because what's going to happen is I'm going to export this as an audio file. So this allows me to kind of create a variation in the dynamics of the sound and then kind of create a snapshot, like I said, frees up CPU usage and, sort of concretes a certain sound, and, allows you to move on to another process in the track. But anyway, so here I found myself using a pretty high attack on the subs and a pretty low attack on the sort of transient mid-range. So here the idea was similar with this sort of envelope, is to kind of accentuate the body as opposed to the transient of the sound. And here I kind of wanted to grab the entire sound and compress it. So I am putting together a video on compression that I'm going to explain a little bit about what these mean, but just for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to actually just solo this, and we're going to listen to what this is doing. It almost works kind of the opposite way to how a sort of volume envelope works, in the fact that a high attack kind of allows the mid or the body to kind of ring out for longer, whereas a low attack just starts the process instantly. Here, I mean, you can hear as the attack goes higher, it gives it more of that body of the kick drum, and that's what we want, obviously, in this layer, So you can also get creative with it. You can, for example, use distortions, all sorts of stuff. Oops, wrong one. You could use distortions, for example, like here on the sample channel. The cool thing about this distortion is it's got a mix, so you can kind of dial in the amount of, how brutal you want that distortion. The transient designer also is a very nice tool. Say, for example, you're not quite getting that punch out of the compressor or out of this like setup that you've done with the transient layer over here. You can still add a transient shaper like after the compressor to accentuate that attack even more so. This sounds really cool when you give it just a little bit of attack, just a little bit of pump, and then boost the speed a little bit. So once I've got it sounding decent, what I do is I will maybe put some EQ on it, get it around a sort of level that I'd probably be using it in the track, and then render it out and chop out just one of them. Because like I was saying, you know, when you start doing processing and stuff, you know, CPU usage can affect how these effects are actually working. You can get these kind of like jumps and stuff in the audio, which can change how you're perceiving a mix or a sound or something like that. So with stuff that's as important as a kick drum and a bass and stuff, it might be a good idea to look at sampling it. So let's just put all of these into a event so we can hear what it sounds like when we play it in sequence. A big thanks to IDM Mag, proud supporters of the dance music scene and my channel.